Thank you all for your attendance today. I'm Mark Lennon, the Secretary of Unions New South Wales, and I'd like to thank you and welcome you to the Trades Hall and have a handover to start the proceedings.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Nice speech. Yes, a good speech is a short speech, I know. I'm Louise Adler. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. This morning, sorry, it should be tonight, but it's not, it's this morning. Before we begin the proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of this place. Well, welcome to the launch of Greg Combet's The Fights of My Life. May I offer a particularly warm welcome to the former Prime Minister, the Honourable Bob Hawke, his superb biographer and dazzling fiction writer Blanche Galpuget, the former Prime Minister, the Honourable Julia Gillard, the Shadow Deputy Prime Minister the Honourable Tanya Plibersek, the Shadow Minister. I was just going to cut to the chase and say welcome comrades one and all, but maybe the parliamentarians, current and former, would like to be acknowledged. So forgive me for the list, so maybe hold the applause to the end of the list of all of those good people who've come today. The Shadow Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, the Honourable Anthony Albanese, the Shadow Attorney-General, the Honourable Mark Dreyfus, Senator Penny Wong, Senator John Faulkner, Senator Doug Cameron, the Honourable Sharon Bird, the Honourable Laurie Ferguson, the Honourable Stephen Jones, the Honourable Luke Foley, the former Treasurer-able, the Honourable Wayne Swan, and the Honourable Peter Garrett, and the Honourable Craig Emerson. Citizens, one and all. And if I have failed to mention anyone, it's because you didn't RSVP, and my apologies in advance. So, to begin the formalities this morning, Richard Keddy, the filmmaker who brought us the wonderful television series about Bob Hawke and Curtin, who's directed over 60 political TV commercials, including the Your Rights at Work campaign for the ACTU, has produced a short film about the early years of Gregory Ivan Combet. It's coming in a moment.
I spoke with Greg Combet just a short while ago. Greg Combet, you're about to get beyond and breathing new life into the union movement. You've got ever-declining membership, tough restrictive industrial laws, with more on the way from a hostile government. I think that Moses probably had it easier leading his people out of the desert. How are you going to do it?
Well, it's a challenge, but I'm very confident and optimistic about the future, actually.
If anyone had asked me, I would have said that I thought unions on balance were more of a nuisance than a help, and probably the MUA was the most troublesome. And as I say, I never heard of Greg Combet. By the end of the waterfront dispute, I was convinced that unions were essential.
So take the photographs and still friends in your mind, hanging on a shelf in good health and good time.
We had all of our legal fees paid. Every workout that was locked out was paid for the time that they were locked out. Alan Fells wanted to put $7 million in for a fund for small businesses that were affected by the stoppage. Now Greg just politely told him that he better go and get that off Chris Corrigan as well. All of our legal fees were paid, all of the redundancy was paid, all of the lost time was paid, and everyone got a chance to walk back through the gate. Now, I would like to associate that with some sort of a victory.
I have never seen a man cast in a more complex, difficult situation with so much at stake than Greg Combet was with James Hardy at the end of 2004. But there's no doubt in my mind that the deal that Greg Combet got was the right deal. It was the best deal. And it was a better deal than anyone during the course of 2004 or at the end of the Jackson inquiry, seeing the complete scene, seeing the legal difficulties, seeing the landscape as it was. It was a better deal than anyone on the union side had any legitimate right to expect.
Real democracies uphold human rights and encourage tolerance and respect.
Hello. Oh, hi, Mr. White.
We must not be the first generation of Australians who leaves our kids with fewer rights at work than we inherited.
You can't sack me. Really?
Decent societies do not leave people behind. They reach out and lend a hand where it's needed. And those values are the foundation of our campaign. Your rights at work are not just worth fighting for, they are worth voting for.
I hope you have the time of your life.
And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the ALP's National Secretary, George Wright. Please make him welcome.
Thank you very much. He's not bad, is he? It's really, yeah. It's a great privilege to be here, Greg, at your book launch. And I'm the ALP National Secretary, but really I'm here today as a friend of Greg and someone who worked with him on some of the fights of his life that he shares with us in this book. It's also great to be here to introduce Julia Gillard, who I also had the privilege of working with when she was the Prime Minister of Australia. And 10 months Tony Abbott remind you of what a good time that was, Julia. Yeah. Greg Combet and Julia Gillard. Without a doubt amongst the best of the left. For their generation, these are two great people of the left, of the union movement and the Labor Party. They represent its greatest traditions. Neither of them are what you would call dreamers, though Greg has insisted to me on more than one occasion that amongst some women of a certain age and a certain political persuasion, he is still considered just a little bit dreamy. It's true. No, Greg and Julia are not just dreamers, they're doers. And both Greg and Julia have been criticised on occasions by their own colleagues on the left for being pragmatists, because neither of them has ever been happy to settle for what Greg calls the glorious defeat. For these two, it's been about winning to get results. They're both driven by a burning desire for fairness and justice, a determination to make a difference and to deliver. real results, real programs, real reforms and real wins. During the time I had the privilege to work with Greg, this meant battling to secure the rightful entitlements, 16,000 workers who lost everything or risked losing everything when Ansett collapsed. This was achieved. The campaign of shame against James Hardie, not to make the company feel bad, but to make them pay up and deliver justice for those who would otherwise have been denied it. This was achieved. And of course, the battle against the Liberals' abhorrent work choices IR laws, not to protest against them, but to knock them off. And when Julia and Greg introduced the Fair Work Act into the Parliament in 2008, again, this was achieved. Greg's story is a story of getting things done. As he points out in the book, Greg is fundamentally a shy person. He was never a baby-kissing, hand-shaking, work-the-room type. But you only needed to see him, as I have, listening to groups of workers faced with real challenges, to realise his humanity and how deeply and seriously he feels for the people and principles he's fought and won for. And though deeply pragmatic, you only need to see Greg in those meetings with James Hardie's lawyers to also understand his deep passion and strength when it comes to winning what was right. Greg is a wonderful person to work with. He's tough, he's smart, he's disciplined, always crystal clear about what we needed to achieve and why. And he didn't mind a long lunch once the work was done and the win was banked. Hangover from the MUA days, I think, Greg, eh? He's someone you couldn't help but admire and look up to, as I did and I still do today. But he can also be a scary bastard. Those who know Greg well know that behind his genuine empathy and generosity, there is a ruthless killer instinct. And God help you if it's unleashed on you. I never copped it, but I saw a few others who did. I saw it when some of the corporate spiv types in the Ansett and Hardie's negotiations failed to pay Greg the respect his intellect and the people he was representing deserved to be paid. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck as the old-school Thai types tried to fob Greg off or treat him and those he represented as uninformed or inferior. Big mistake. Big mistake. Needless to say, Greg always won, and in doing so, he always got his man. Greg Combet, The Fight of My Life, is a great read. Like Greg, it is accurate, honest, energetic, at times emotional, and yes, Greg, even very occasionally funny. And not for Greg, a book of indulgent pontifications. Mark Davis, who like me has worked with Greg and knows firsthand the pace and drive of that toil, has given a purposeful rhythm and tempo to this book that beautifully captures Greg's enormous drive and focus. This book is not a memoir. This book is a story. The story of Greg Combet, a great Australian Labor movement man, a man who I'm deeply proud to have worked with and to call my friend. Buy it, you'll like it.
Well, MEP's tagline for the last decade has been books with spine, but I think we're just going to change it to buy it. You'll like it. I think it's brilliant. Thank you, George. And if you want a commission, we can talk about it later. In early 2011, the then Prime Minister Julia Gillard agreed to launch Christine Nixon's memoir, Fair Cop. We publishers are always cognizant that in dealing with politicians, there are pressures beyond our control, that determining to support a book or not will always be the subject of careful calibration. Christine Nixon had been the subject to the kind of relentless campaigning that Julia Gillard would come to endure. We certainly expected that the Prime Minister would eventually decide to withdraw. Why attract even more static by associating with a police commissioner who'd been hounded out of office? And yet Julia Gillard did not withdraw. Indeed, she gave a terrific speech endorsing the quality and significance of Christine Nixon's leadership. The Prime Minister even inadvertently renamed the book Fair Cop, becoming Top Cop. MEP was deeply appreciative of the steadfastness that Gillard displayed amidst the media scrum that day. We're equally appreciative that she's agreed to join us today to launch Greg Combet's The Fights of My Life. Please join me in welcoming the Honourable Julia Gillard, Australia's 27th Prime Minister, a Labor warrior and a parliamentarian for 15 years, Julia Gillard.
Thank you. I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and in a spirit of reconciliation, paying my respects to elders past and present. Greg, thank you so very much for asking me to launch this book, The Fights of My Life. It's a great honour and a task made easy because I enjoyed the book so much. As soon as I turned the last page, I knew that there was only one way for me to start this speech. And of course, it is with your candid revelation of a conversation between us. The one in which you said, "I'm stuffed if I'll be tweeting." A statement made in response to my suggestion as Prime Minister that ministers should be making more use of social media. Now, actually, the word used and recorded in the book is a little bit more earthy than stuffed. But I am conscious that we are still in children's viewing hours, and perhaps this is a very good moment to issue a more general warning. If bad language causes you to blush, then have a cold compress at hand which you will need to pat your burning face as you read this book. You will definitely need it. Indeed, some might suggest that Greg's aversion to tweeting is simply because he couldn't fit all the swear words in. But I think it runs deeper than this, and his retort to me stemmed from a concern that the complex business of changing the nation, of making it stronger and fairer, as we strive to do, is not easily boiled down to 140 characters or less. In my view, the problem Greg was really trying to name isn't one that only besets Twitter. Across the full range of modern media, print, television, the internet, social media, the drive to dish out news stories ever more quickly, simply because the technology means that we can, is depriving us all of context. So, a personality as complex and deep as Greg Combet arrives in Canberra, and because 10% of his life story is known, the remaining context, the other 90%, remains undiscovered. Effectively, the whole story is categorised as old news not worth telling. To borrow the words of legendary art critic Robert Hughes, the shock of the new now defeats exploring the nuanced depths of what has been. Ignored in this process is the way the past plays a role in shaping the future, how individuals are moulded, how their attitudes and predispositions come about, how their character strengths and flaws are created, and what the sum of all of these parts means for their contemporary and future conduct. So for me, the importance of this book lies in the way it beautifully gives us the context that enables us to better understand the large life and important works of Greg Combet. I delighted in the images the book gives us of the boy growing up on what is described as a small island, a time and place separate and self-contained, yet also part of the larger whole, on the Minchinbury estate owned by the Penfold Wine Company. Here and at his grandparents' farm, he lives a cocooned but not cosseted existence. His memories are of roaming the great outdoors and his own contribution to the manual work required in the vineyard and field. This childhood was lost with the death of Greg's father, but through the words of this book, we see the grieving child grow into a young man who emerges with an engineer's mind combined with a growing sense of social conscience and the firmest of lifetime friendships with Greg Withers, who is here today. Then we are all taken through the many fights of Greg's life, battles for fairness and decency, all of them. The fights in Greg's life include some that we fought together on workplace relations, creating an emissions trading scheme, increasing job opportunities. There is so much I could canvass on each of these, but it is not my intention to do so today. To suffice it to say that we shared a sense of purpose in each of these areas. We enacted reforms our nation needed. When we lost office, it was clear some would endure, some would be set back, only to emerge again in the future. Ultimately, good policy wins through. The fight I do want to focus on is the one told in what for me was the most moving chapter of the book. It is the epic struggle against James Hardie for those poisoned by its asbestos. The scale of the injustice, the cruelty of the corporate conduct, the courage of the victims, and Greg's sense of burning righteous anger burns on every page. Two sentences in particular capture the motivating power of Greg's emotions when he says, and I quote, "I sometimes feel a flame flickering in my guts, and when I see an injustice like this, it flares up. I remember being about as angry as I have ever been and determined to fight." We are given another insight into how remarkable a man Bernie Banton was, a tireless campaigner for justice, even as asbestos was killing him. When Greg asked Bernie to ease up a little on personal criticisms of those representing James Hardie as negotiations were in train, Bernie replied, "I'm dying. And what have these people got? Hurt feelings? I'll keep going." I acknowledge Karen, Bernie's widow, who is here with us today, and thank her for everything she and her family did and continue to do on behalf of all those afflicted by asbestos-related diseases. While intellectually you know how the story ends, the events are so powerfully retold that you cheer once again when the largest personal injury settlement in Australia's history is struck to benefit those so grievously wronged. In this fight and many others detailed in the book, we see the best of the trade union movement shine through. The values of corporate Australia should not be judged by the ugly manoeuvring of James Hardie to rob the dying, just as the values of hundreds of thousands of hard-working, honest, fair-minded trade unionists and their elected representatives should not be judged by the fraudulent conduct of the few. Greg, as a nation, we should be so grateful to you for having the energy, integrity and courage to fight so many good fights across your life. We have been enriched by your efforts. But as the book details clearly, we know that there has been a personal cost. Often that cost was borne by your family and friends, burdens measured in hours of absence and increments of lost anonymity. But you have borne it personally too, in episodes of ill health and times of exhaustion. Thank you for having the spirit to see so much through despite these difficulties. I thank you, and I also thank Mark Davis for bringing your life and thoughts to us in prose that always engages and often sparkles. I have known Mark, and here's a revelation about both of us, since I was an undergraduate and new activist at Adelaide University, and he was one of the editors of the student newspaper On D. I am not going to recount how many years have passed since then. But much has happened in those years, but one constant has been Mark's love of and skill with the written word. Of course, I am conscious that the political junkies in the room want me to tell one more story before I go. A paragraph with the words Labor and leadership is completely seducing for those who have spent most of the last few years churning out so many stories featuring those very words. For me, it seems enough at this stage to simply say this. Despite the best efforts of wonderful supporters, there came a time when it was clear to me that my leadership was very likely to come to an early end. My belief that the nation and my political party should be led by a person of good values and clear sense of purpose remains strong. Fortunately, the Labor Party is home to so many with these attributes. But my view was that the best person at that time was Greg Combet. I wanted to see the next fight of his life being for the support of his colleagues to lead the Labor government into the 2013 election. It was not to be. Now, Bill Shorten, as Labor leader, is taking his remarkable talents and fierce passion into the fight for fairness and a better future. I wish him and the team he leads, many of whom are here today, all the best. I and true believers everywhere are cheering you on. This book concludes with the following words, and I quote, "My aim in writing this memoir has been to demonstrate why it is worthwhile to sign up for a life as a Labor movement activist, to demonstrate that people with common values working together can make a massive difference. Much has been achieved, much remains to be achieved. We need people with passion and energy, intelligence and good sense to join the Labor movement. For me, this has been a cause worth fighting for, and I hope to be able to continue to contribute. There's some fight left in me yet." Greg, I launch this book, confident that it will achieve your goal and inspire a new generation. I launch it with a hearty wish for the best of health and happiness for you and Juanita. I launch it admiring what you have achieved, but looking forward to seeing you win through in new fights and in new ways. Ladies and gentlemen, here it is, Greg Combet's The Fights of My Life. Thank you very much.
Well, it's getting increasingly teary as we go along this morning. Thank you so much, Julia Gillard, for such a warm, generous and thoughtful reading of Greg's memoirs and indeed his life. I have to say, though, I did feel that you made somewhat of a grave error in choosing another publisher. But of course, Ms Gillard, we wish you very well as you join the swelling ranks of political memoirists. The truism is that books by Liberals don't sell. Until John Howard's book, Bob Hawke's memoirs, were the best-selling political memoirs of all time. Ms Gillard, if I may be so presumptuous, after Combet's has sold out, we do hope that you outsell John Howard by a zillion copies. And now to the author of the hour. To suggest that Combet was a diffident author would be to understate the case. It took long months of courtship to persuade him, that he should write a memoir. Those months of courtship included a false start in 2012. After some persistence, Greg finally agreed to talk to me in his Parliament House office. Well, in truth, he gave me about 20 minutes to make a pitch that the Labor Party desperately needed to articulate its values, what it stood for and what it stood against. With his sleeves rolled up, he listened politely for a little while.